Today we're going to start our lesson on Rome, and the title of our lesson is From Republic to Empire. Now, when you learn about Rome, usually you think of Rome as the greatest and most powerful empire in the history of our world, and that's exactly right. You're right on, and your teachers have done a real good job teaching you that. But what some people don't understand and what don't know is that Rome actually started as a republic. In 509 BC, the city of Rome was founded, and the place of Rome was founded as a republic, not an empire, okay? If there are four words that we use to characterize Roman people, some of them look familiar from our lesson on the Greeks. Romans are very courageous, very loyal, very devoted, and as we get into the second part of the lesson today, we're very, very disciplined. Now, Rome, basically, let's start by talking about the geography. Now, Rome was basically on the Italian peninsula. It's a thin peninsula. And the major geographic feature that you probably labeled already on a map were the Apennine Mountains. Now, the Apennine Mountains were said to be the backbone of Italy. And we call it that because it runs just like your backbone does down the middle of your body. Now, very, very different from the short, rugged mountains that we talked about in Greece. The Apennine Mountains were very crossable, so you could literally move from east to west and walk right across them anytime you wanted to in Italy, which hopefully from the start shows you that if the Italians ever wanted to, or the people living in the peninsula ever wanted to unite, they probably could unite, all right? It's going to be a little bit different politically than the Greeks. Now, in Italy, there are fertile plains. There are plenty of rivers, okay? So that's going to allow for their civilization to be created a lot differently than the Greeks and a little bit more similar to the river valley civilizations. You have the Po River to the north. You have the Tiber River, which runs through Rome to this day, and so on. So like I said, it's going to be very easy for Italy to trade, or the people that were living there in present-day Italy to trade. It's very easy to cross, but at the same time, as this peninsula juts out into the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea, hint, hint, if it would ever to be invaded, it would be very easy to do that. Now, if you have been to Rome, you'll know that they tell you that the earliest inhabitants of the Italian peninsula were three different groups of people. You're going to have the Etruscans to the north, the Latins, there in blue on the diagram in the central part, and then from our lessons on the Greeks, remember the old Greek colonies are going to be left over, and those Greeks are going to colonize parts of southern, what we call Italy today. Then, very easy to unite, very hard to invade. So as far as the geography is concerned of Italy, or what is then, the Italian peninsula, is going to be very different than the Greeks. Now, if you've ever been to Rome, the major river that runs through Rome is the Tiber River, okay? Now, Italy itself, the Italian peninsula, is very easy to invade, very easy to unite. Rome itself, the city, would be different, all right? The Tiber River runs through it. Rome was founded around 7 hills. If you've ever been to Rome, it's a beautiful city. And Rome, the city itself, would be very, very hard to invade. The Italian peninsula is easy to invade. The city of Rome is very hard to invade, okay, if it were to ever be invaded in its future, and we'll get to that next week. So let's talk about Rome. Let's talk about Rome the Republic. So in 509 BC, Rome was founded as a republic. It's called a thing of the people. Now, I always ask you if the United States is a republic. Well, let me tell you what a republic is. A republic is a type of government where voters vote, the people vote for representatives to make decisions for them. So I would ask you, is the United States a form of a republic? And there would be some hands that would go up, and there would be some hands that would go down. If your hand was up, I would ask you to stand up and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So you would say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. Every morning when we say the pledge, we reinforce that the United States is a republic. Yes, it is. Do we vote for representatives to make decisions for us? Absolutely. So the republic that Rome was founded on is a huge characteristic of the United States government. Okay? Now, Rome the Republic was founded and it had two social classes. It had an upper class, basically, and a lower class. Now, the upper class of Rome was called the patricians. Those were all the government officials in Rome. If you were a government official, you were considered a member of the upper class. Now, the most powerful group of people in the early Roman Republic was a group called the Senate, senators. Maybe that word sounds familiar to you. We'll talk about that at the end of the slide. Now, whenever in a government you're in charge of the money, you're in charge of the funds, you're probably going to be the most powerful group, and the Senate was. The Senate in the early Roman Republic was in charge of the money, it was in charge of foreign policy, and it was charged of the court system. And in the early Republic, there were 300 senators, 300 senators. I would stop and ask you how many senators there are in the United States. If you know there's 50 states, and no matter what the population is, every state in the United States is allowed 2 senators, no matter what the population is, you would take 50 times 2 and come up with 100 senators that we have here in the United States. So compare that to the early Roman Republic's number of 300, and you'll probably have a deduction that there were a lot of senators, a lot of representatives in Rome from the start. There was another group of people under the Senate called the magistrates. That was broken down into a couple different groups as well. There's a group called the consuls. There were 2 elected officials that made decisions about the army and war and so on. There's a group called the praetors. There's a group called the censors. And they basically were in charge of taking care of the armies and making sure that the system of checks and balances was in place, where not one branch of government became too powerful over the other ones. Now, this is what it would probably look like. This is definitely where they would set up, and they would look, and it looks pretty similar to our Congress. Now, if you're looking closely on this slide, you can see that there are words that we have heard of before. Republic, Senate. Magistrates are actually names of early judges in the colonial cities of the New England colonies. They're still called magistrates to this day. And then obviously checks and balances is a characteristic, one of the main characteristics of our Constitution. So it's very easy to say that the Roman Republic that it was founded upon early definitely influenced the United States government to this day, which is pretty cool to think about. Now, the second group of people were the plebeians, okay? So the patricians were the upper class. That was if you had a government title, if you were within the government, you were considered to be a patrician. The plebeians were basically everybody else. They were farmers, they were merchants, they were traders, and they had very, very little influence in government, these plebeians. Now, you might see that word and you might have understood that word if you know somebody that is in our armed forces or go to a military school, whether it's West Point in the Army, whether it's the Naval Academy. When you step on campus from the start as a freshman at military academies, you're called a plebe. A plebe. You might have seen that word before, or maybe your family has a member that goes to a military school. They're called plebes. That's where we get the word from. It's basically the bottom of the barrel and everybody else in the old Roman Republic. So as I said a second ago, the plebeians had very, very, very little influence in government and hardly a say in government. All the say and all the different decisions that were being made early in the Republic were being made by the patricians. Well, that's going to change, and the patricians are going to make a mistake, so to speak, in their case, as the Republic got going, and they're going to allow the plebeians to have some say in government. In fact, the patricians are going to allow the plebeians to elect 10 officials to make decisions for the lower class. Those 10 officials were called tribunes. Tribunes were people that were plebeians, that were elected. There was 10 of them that were elected by the group to have a little bit of influence and say. In fact, the patricians took it a step further and allowed for these tribunes to have veto power. That was a big mistake. Now, veto means to reject. And in this case, veto means to reject laws. Now, there's people in our government or a person in government that does have this veto power here in the United States, and that's the President of the United States, okay? So you can see how that has changed and evolved over the years. So now, as we get into the Republic, now the plebeians have some say, and it's in the form of these tribunes that were representatives that were voted on to make decisions for them. Now, one of the biggest gripes of the plebeians and one of the first acts of the tribunes was the lower class always had a problem with the laws of Rome. And the biggest problem was that they did not appreciate the fact that the laws of Rome were not written down. Well, that's going to change about 50 years into the Republic. And in 450 BC, as the plebeians are forcing the patricians to write the laws down, this was the effect. The effect was the 12 tables, the 12 tablets that you might see. These are the original laws of Rome. And they were stationed perfectly right in the middle of the Forum. The Forum was an area in Rome, right in the middle of the city, where the original laws of Rome were posted. And these laws were called the 12 tables. Now, the 12 tables it's going to be one of the harshest law codes in the history of Rome. You're going to see some influence from the laws of Hammurabi. You're going to see some laws from early River Valley civilizations that we have talked about. All right. So let's talk about a couple of these early, basically, laws of Rome. The original laws of Rome had a death penalty. It had a death penalty within the 12 tables. It was perfectly legal to have a death penalty. Now, if you were convicted of libel, you could be put to death. Now, libel and the opposite of libel is slander. You might have heard of that word before. Slander is when you speak falsely about someone. Libel is when you write it down. So if you wrote down in an attempt to harm a person's reputation, you could die for that. If you tried to bribe a political official in Rome, you could die for that. If you murdered somebody, you died. If you stole a neighbor's chicken, there's a good case that you died. If you set a fire, arson, you died. All right? This is a very strict law code, and it made the Roman citizens extremely disciplined. You did not want to get in trouble in early Rome because you would be put to death for minor offenses that we look at today, like bribery and libel and so on. Now, in the original laws of Rome, it said that patricians could not marry plebeians. A member of the upper class could not marry a member of the lower class. Now, don't go Egyptian on me, and don't go to the old fact that the upper class in Egypt could only marry within the upper class. It wasn't like that, okay? There was plenty of patricians. There were huge numbers where family members did not have to marry other family members, okay? But that was an original law of Rome. Now, in the original laws of Rome, these 12 tables, it basically establishes a very patriarchal society. Patriarchal, meaning that the father had all of the authority in Roman families. And in fact, one of my favorite parts of this entire lesson is in the original laws of Rome, these 12 tables, it basically wrote down what a father could do to their children if they got in trouble. Now, here are some of my favorites. Number one, it said that if a kid got in trouble in Rome, by law, it was legal for a father to beat the heck out of them. All right, fathers could whip their children in Rome if they got in trouble. Here's a good one. They could also send them to prison. Imagine that. You come home, you get a bad grade on your test, your father could literally send you to prison. And the father would go to the local prison and they would negotiate the amount of time that the child would have to stay in prison. It's a pretty fun concept. So fathers in Rome, it was legal to send their kids to jail if they got in trouble. Here's a good one. They could sell them. Fathers in Rome, if they were upset with their children, could sell their children. Sell their children into slavery. You'd go, you would negotiate a price and so on. And it's very, very drastic, the fourth one. In all the reading that you've done, there's never one written account of this ever happening, but it was perfectly legal if it did happen. A father could kill their children. Now, obviously, the 12 tables, by looking at a few of these laws that were written within the 12 tables, shows you that, once again, you did not want to get in trouble in Rome. And you did not definitely want to have dad on your bad side. Now, this is going to create a society based on discipline, following the law, being devoted to the law, and following the rules, okay? And there's going to be some pretty good effects of that. So the Roman Republic was only around for about 50 years, okay? After that time, Rome is going to look to expand, okay? So I told you this, the title of this lesson is called Rome from Republic to Empire. Rome from Republic to Empire. Now, the empire starts and is built as an effect of the army, okay? So along the way, the Romans are going to be creating this army, and it's an army that's going to be filled by citizen soldiers, not foreign people, but all Roman soldiers. Now, if there was a word that was used to describe these early citizen soldiers of the Roman army, it was discipline. They were a disciplined fighting force. Now, the basic unit of the Roman army was called a legion. A legion. And there would be a couple thousand soldiers in those legions, which we called legionnaires. So whenever there was a time on the countryside when there was a problem, the Roman government would send a legion out to that area and take care of that problem very, very fast, okay? And that's how Rome started to create this empire. It was because of a strong army, okay? So where do they go first? What's the first event that happens here that moves Rome from being a gentle republic, a democracy, just like we have, into creating the most powerful empire ever in the history of the world? The event that is going to spark this idea of Rome looking outward, looking to expand territory and creating an empire, is an event called the Punic Wars, okay? It's an event that happened from 264 to 146 BC, okay? And there was 3 of them. Now, Punic comes from the word punicus, which means Phoenician. Phoenician. And we know that in the northern part of Africa, the Phoenicians, from our old lessons on Mesopotamia and our lessons on Greece, we saw had created colonies. And what's going to form out of those Phoenician colonies is a very powerful city in northern Africa called Carthage. Carthage. And Carthage had a problem with Rome. And Rome had a problem with Carthage, starting in 264 BC to the point where they're going to fight a series of wars. And those wars are going to be called the Punic Wars. Now, in the first Punic War, it's going to be a Roman victory. Punic War number 1. Punic War number 1 was a naval battle, and it was fought over the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Those islands belonged to Carthage. Rome wanted them, and you can see the map and you can see how it's highlighted. Now, Carthage, being that they were old descendants of the Phoenicians, which you know the Phoenicians were very good sailors, Carthage had a fantastic navy. Fantastic navy. They were great sailors. Rome, in its infancy, when the army was just starting out, didn't have a great navy. Their navy was based on characteristics and ideas and influence from the Greeks, okay? So you're going to see these triremes. Now, how in the heck did Rome win a naval battle over Carthage, who had a great navy? Well, one thing that Rome did was they had a practice of ramming their ships into Carthaginian ships. They literally rammed their ships into Carthaginian ships. And in the process, what they would do is they would have wooden planks. They would have wooden planks. So as the diagram shows, imagine that's a Roman ship. They would ram into a ship. They would have huge grapple hooks, like a treble hook, a three-pronged huge hook that was attached by a chain. They would throw the grapple hook over to the Carthaginian ship, pull it close, take that wooden plank, put the wooden plank from the Roman ship to the Carthaginian ship, and then they would board the ship. Now, these Roman legionnaires were great fighters, as I said. So what happened was the Romans, by creating this plank and bringing the ships closer together, they allowed for their legionnaires to fight the Carthaginians basically within the ships on the water. And when those legionnaires would cross over into the Carthaginian ships, they would just beat the heck out of the Carthaginians on those ships, okay? So the Carthaginian navy, which should have been a huge advantage, was nullified by the technique that the Romans used in this battle. So the Roman victory comes in Punic War number 1, and the reward for that and the effect for that was that the Romans were now given Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, okay? Now, Punic War number 2 is a fun one to talk about. It's where we get introduced to one of the greatest military commanders in the history of the world. We get introduced to a Carthaginian general named Hannibal. Now, Hannibal's story starts as he is about to go ahead and take his army, thousands and thousands and thousands of Carthaginians. Follow this on your mental map. He's going to move from northwest Africa, and he's going to take this army across the little part of the Mediterranean Sea and move into Spain. He then is going to move his army, which includes tons of war elephants that they used in battle that were effective. They're going to walk across southern Spain. They're going to move to the northeast. They're going to move into what is now present-day southern France, which back then was called Gaul. Now, just as they were getting to knock on the doorstep of invading the Italian peninsula, they had to go through the Alps. And the art and the pictures on the map show you that these elephants and these soldiers literally fell off the cliffs through the Alps. Hannibal, it was said, is going to lose over half of his army, half of his fighting force, as he was moving through the Alps. If you look really close, you can see the poor little elephants falling off the cliffs. And artists over the years have depicted this very interesting event of Hannibal trying to cross through the Alps and invade the Romans within the Italian peninsula. Well, he gets across the Alps with half his fighting force. So the Romans are going to send legion after legion after this Hannibal. And Hannibal defeats legion after legion. The Carthaginians actually are going to defeat legion after legion that are sent off to the countryside to defeat him. So imagine Hannibal and this Carthaginian army going through Spain, gets half of his army, a little less than half of his army through the Alps, and he's going to filter into the Italian peninsula to the point where he makes camp right outside of Rome. Now, Hannibal had a plan, and it had to do with a guy named Hasdrubal. Now, Hasdrubal, as you can see on the slide, was Hannibal's brother, okay? Hasdrubal was camped over in northwestern part of Italy. He left a reinforcement army behind. Well, the Romans, during Punic War number 2, happened to find out about this reinforcement army led by his brother Hasdrubal. And they're going to ride a couple legions off to defeat this army and annihilate this army. Now, one of the legions is going to cut the head off of Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother. He's going to bring the head of Hannibal's brother back to Italy. And the Romans are literally going to go to Hannibal's camp and roll the head of Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother. They will literally roll the head into Hannibal's camp. And Hannibal says, uh-oh, the Romans know about my reinforcement army because obviously here's the head of my brother. And they are going to tuck tail and run out of Italy. It's one of those historical events that would definitely change history. Who knows what would have happened if Hannibal would have got his entire Carthaginian army through the Alps and went into Rome and defeated the Romans during this time. But coincidentally, it didn't work out for him. And the Romans will chase Hannibal out of Italy through Sicily and back to Carthage and live to fight another day. So Punic War number 2 was definitely a Roman victory. Now, by the time Punic War number 3 came around, the Romans had had enough of Carthage, And they're going to literally invade Carthage. So the Punic War number 3, basically the Romans invade Carthage. They're going to send down Roman legions that are going to be led by a great Roman general named Scipio. And they're going to fight a very famous battle called the Battle of Zama in Carthage. The Romans are going to annihilate Carthage. For you Hannibal fans in the crowd, Hannibal escapes. He is not touched, but does not fight again. And history really is a little bit unsure about what actually happens to Hannibal, okay? But he has no effect on this battle whatsoever. So the Romans are going to annihilate the Carthaginians at the Battle of Zama. Now, the Romans they weren't exactly very nice conquerors from the start, as we're going to find out over our first couple lessons here. In fact, the Romans, for example, when they go to Carthage, they're going to bring barrels and barrels of salt with them. And in Carthage, they're actually going to take the salt and pour it all over the fertile land in Carthage, destroying crops and not allowing for the Carthaginians to grow crops in those areas ever again. Okay? So literally, the goal was to get rid of this annoyance called Carthage, and they literally tried to wipe them off the face of the map, okay? So you can see the way that the Romans conquered, you can see their idea of the way that they wanted to conquer people, and they weren't very nice to conquered people early on as they're creating this empire. So this was the event called the Punic Wars, which is going to be the first event of the Romans looking to move outward and create an empire. So where do they go from here? Well, the last part of our lesson today happens from this idea of Roman imperialism. Imperialism is when you go to another place and you take the territory outright. You make them a colony. That's what is meant by Roman imperialism. So what are they going to do with this? Well, they're going to, in a very short amount of time, basically conquer the entire western part of the Mediterranean Sea and the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. They're going to go to Greece, and they're going to conquer Greece in 197 BC. They're going to go and they're going to conquer what was left of Macedonia, the leftovers from Alexander the Great's great empire ruled by one of his generals. Going to go to Asia Minor. All right, they're going to crush those territories and crush those areas first, okay? So after the victory over the Carthaginians, they move basically east. They go to Greece, they go to Macedonia, they go to Asia Minor. Now, to finish with today, there's a really good map here that shows you what happens by 133 BC. By 133 BC, you can see that the Romans have an empire that stretches from Spain all the way to Egypt, okay? By 133 BC, this is the Roman Empire at its height. You can see that it goes all the way north, up into Great Britain, the majority of North Africa and Egypt, all right, Asia Minor. Basically, all the places west that we've talked about so far in this lesson in the Eastern Hemisphere, except for in the old parts of Alexander's empire, the Middle East there, parts of it were taken, which will have huge influence in the origin of Christianity, which we'll go ahead and talk about later in this lesson. India wasn't touched. China wasn't touched. It's almost like the Romans took an idea from the Alexander the Great's book and did not move far east because they saw what happened to Alexander. So by the end of this lesson, and by the end of by 133 BC, basically the Romans were very cocky and very arrogant about creating this empire, and now saying that, as I say at the bottom of the slide, the Mediterranean now belongs to us. It is our sea, and that's where we're going to end for the day.